I'm Catherine, and I'm an intern with the Centre for Forest Protection based at Kew. And for the past 6 months, I've been doing an internship to map the distribution of elm in the UK. So to start with, I'm going to give a quick overview of all the different elms that can be found in the UK. So we have the most commonly found elms, which are the native wych elm, field elm, and English elm. And then these two species, Ulmus glabra and Ulmus minor, naturally form hybrids in areas where their range overlaps. So we also have hybrids between these species. And then elm has a long history of being cultivated, leading to the development of many cultivars. And then due to their use as ornamental trees, lots of non-native species and their cultivars have also been planted in the country. And then, of course, with Dutch elm disease in the 20th century, most of the mature elms that were distinctive of the landscape were killed, which has led to elms still being able to persist, but as small recruitment elms that often fail to reach maturity. And so in response, efforts have been made to identify native elms that may be exhibiting resistance, but also to breed resistant elms. So in the UK, we have the British elm species, we have their hybrids, we have elm cultivars, we have introduced species, and now we have disease-resistant cultivars. Here is a timeline that I made of various dates in which these disease-resistant cultivars were either introduced to the UK through trials or elm planting projects, or dates of their commercial release where the introduction date wasn't available. And you can see that over time, a large number of these cultivars have been produced, and those that are highlighted in pink contain Asiatic elms in their ancestry in order to increase the resistance. And I believe Kaz is going to be talking in more detail about one of these in particular in her genomics work. So with all of these different types of elms in mind, I set out to gather data for all of the different types of elm in the UK, map their distributions, and then collate this information into a database. I also set out to update records of Sapura autumn gold cultivars that were planted in the 1980s as part of a campaign that distributed them to schools around the country. This would be a great opportunity to collect data on mature cultivars, as many of them are particularly new. This is like a knowledge gap that would help determine their long-term suitability. To do this, I collected data from a variety of sources, including open data repositories, and then also directly communicating with individuals. I then organised the data and filtered it. The taxonomy of elms is very complex, and so you could find many different names being used in different sources. And so I assigned synonyms where I could to make sure that maps represented the same taxa where possible. And then once I'd done this, I removed duplicates based on their name and their location. And then I used this to map the distribution. So in total, over 125,000 records were obtained, and this was reduced to about 80,000 after I'd filtered them. 336 different elm names were used, but then after I applied synonyms, this was 269 distinct elms. You can see from the graph on the right that the majority of these were cultivars, but there was also a large number of hybrids and a large number of species, considering the number of non-native species that have been planted. Although I think the first record was from 1794, over half of the records were from the year 2000 onwards, which indicated that the data was representative more of the current state of elms rather than a historical relic. And then some of these elms didn't have any location information. So in the end, I was able to produce maps for 252 different types of elm. I don't have time to go through all 252, so I'm just going to give a summary of the results. So to start with, we have the British elms, and the data agreed with previously described distributions of these different elms, with field elm and English elm more prevalent in the south and southeast England, and then wych elm more frequently recorded as you move northwards. So this was a really great starting point, and the distribution was similar even when you filtered the records for those more recent ones. And then, as I mentioned, there are lots of elm cultivars and non-native species that have been planted in the UK. And the distribution of these showed this nicely, as their distributions were rather sporadic and they were more rare in occurrence, which indicated them being planted in gardens or as street trees. So I've got two examples here, one of a wych elm cultivar, which, although it actually had a fair few number of records for a cultivar, they are kind of all spread out, which shows that they've been planted. And then a North American elm, Ulmus rubra, which has also been planted in parks and gardens in the UK. To follow on from what Joan was saying earlier about Ulmus laevis, although this is an introduced European elm, it has been a more of a wide distribution compared to the other introduced species, and this is because of its incorporation into elm planting projects. So over half of these trees shown on this map here were planted in the last 10 years due to its unattractiveness to the beetle. In addition to Ulmus laevis, lots of disease-resistant cultivars have been trialled and planted in the UK. So the data showed that a total of 73 different types have been introduced. However, over 2/3 of these were of just 5 cultivars, with the highest number of records for Lutece, followed by New Horizon, Adamus, Lobel, and Sapura Autumn Gold. And these seem to have tended to be planted in the south of England, with the highest number of records in Hampshire, followed by Greater London and Brighton and Hove. So I'm going to finish with 2 examples of why collecting this data and mapping these distributions is important. And so to start with, I think that my attempt to update records of Sapura Autumn Gold trees from this campaign in the 1980s demonstrates this nicely. So from the Conservation Foundation's archives, there was a list of 250 schools that were sent these cultivars. I was able to contact 137 of them, largely due to a number closing down or moving site. And then I only had responses from 28, and most of these didn't know anything about the elm and had no record of it on site. I did, however, manage to find 3 that were still alive, like this one on the right. But I think this shows that by accurately keeping records and maintaining relationships with people participating in campaigns, it will facilitate long-term monitoring to be able to see the performance in the long term. And then another way that the data could be used is to look at mature surviving elms. So from the data set, I was able to map the distribution of all elms that were either over 30 years old or described as mature. And that's the graph on the left. And then on the right, I filtered that further down into the mature British elms. Projects that have focused on propagating and planting out these elms have included those like the Great British Elm Experiment, again carried out by the Conservation Foundation, which propagated cuttings from a number of parent trees which were appearing to have survived the disease and so may or may not be resistant. So this is a great way to test it. And here I managed to plot maps for each parent tree. And I know the dots are quite small, but there are a few that have been reported to be dead. And so over time, it will become clear whether these trees have resistant traits and that would be a great example of native trees which are exhibiting resistance. So to summarize, I think my project demonstrated that accurately documenting elms and their locations can support long-term monitoring and future research on elms. But this will also be dependent on collaborating and maintaining relationships with people participating in planting projects. From the data, you can also identify and track trees of interest, whether it's an ornamental trait, a climate tolerant trait, or resistance to diseases, not just Dutch elm disease, but other pathogens that affect elms. And then these could be used in future breeding work. I think it's also important to note that there were just 5 cultivars that were planted widely, and so it will be important to broaden the range of elms being used, but this is also dependent on availability and supply. So the records from this project are going to be compiled into an accessible database, and Richard, my supervisor, has also set up 2 iNaturalist projects, one for elms in the UK and one for planted elms. So I recommend that everyone checks these out and, if possible, submits their elm observations there as a great way to share data. So thank you for listening. A huge thank you to my supervisor, Richard Buggs, and Mohammed, who was a postdoc on this project, David Shreve and the Conservation Foundation, who are project partners, and everyone who provided data. I didn't have space to include everyone, but there are over 29 different sources, and I wouldn't have been able to do this project without you. So thank you.